So I'm going to speak today about the efforts of my agency, the Berkshire Regional Planning Agency, to respond to two recent pipeline requests that we've had. Some of the other presentations that we've been hearing may focus on some of the regulatory aspects or the technical aspects. Actually, the one I just sat in on had the health aspects. This is more about process. What do you do when a pipeline proposal gets thrown into your area or your town? At the risk of making a bad pun, I want to say that I'm one of the guys in the trenches when we have to go to permit the pipeline. So, but first off, a bit about setting the context. I thought when I put together the presentation that there would be more municipal officials here. And when I looked at the attendance, and actually I thought there might be some more from the Northeast area. There aren't very many here. But so when you think about Massachusetts, which is where I'm from, what do you think about? Probably most of you think about the Boston area, all right? You've probably been to Boston. How many people have been to Boston? Everybody goes to Boston. Look at that. Well, okay. But there's another part about Massachusetts. So you think about the Boston skyline, maybe the sense of history, possibly Cape Cod, and possibly, and then you know that it's a very densely developed area. A lot of, actually, I was surprised when I had to look up some of the densities here. It's the third most densely populated state in the nation, only after New Jersey and Rhode Island, which is second. But there is another part of Massachusetts. It's a very rural community. Many of the towns in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is somewhat unique if you're not familiar with it, has 351 different municipalities. For a relatively small-sized state, that's a lot. But a lot of these towns are very small towns. About half of the towns in Massachusetts are under 10,000 population. And I'll get to the import of that in a minute. But Berkshire County, which is where my agency is, has many of those small communities. There are 32 municipalities in Berkshire County. 12 of those have populations under 12,000 people. So my agency, which is a regional planning commission, serves as a technical resource for those communities. How many people have heard of regional planning agencies? Okay, people know, all right. So we have technical resources in land use planning, environmental planning, public health, transportation, and community development. It is within that context that we were faced with two pipeline proposals. The Connecticut expansion proposal, which you'll see runs on the southern part of the state. That blue area was being an expanded area. And then the Northeast Direct project, which changed in the course of the application process to go through southern New Hampshire as well as some of the other counties in Massachusetts, going to from over to the coast in the Dracut area. The Connecticut expansion project was really a pipeline loop, a very small project, consisting of about 3.8 miles of 36-inch diameter pipe with the relative facilities, all in existing right-of-way. One of the issues that we were very concerned about with this proposal was the hydrostatic testing that would take 1 million gallons of water from one of our small ponds. It was actually in a state park, concerned about what those impacts would be. The Connecticut, the NED project was a much more substantial project. In addition to the 188 miles, of new pipeline. There were also various 9 new compressor stations that were going to be proposed, 75 miles of laterals, and 15 new meter stations, as well as other additional modifications. This was actually part of a much larger pipeline proposal that the one from Wright, New York through the Berkshires that is mentioned here is really so-called market path component. There was a supply side component that was going to bring Marcellus shale from Pennsylvania. So I'm going to just speak about the market path component. Pipeline impacts were substantial. There were going to be some public safety and health impacts. We were concerned about those because we're all volunteer fire department in these communities. Folks familiar with volunteer fire departments in other parts of the country. Our transportation infrastructure was very old. We were concerned that the bridges and the roadways would be able to handle the heavy weight from the trucks and the machinery. We had compressor stations that were proposed in 2 of our rural areas. We did actually a sound study in one of the communities that was proposed for the compressor station, and it had some of the lowest ambient noise levels in Massachusetts. I think one of our major concerns was drinking water. This proposed pipeline would cut across an aqueduct that supplied about half the people in our county, of about 129,000 people. So if there was a breach of that aqueduct in one way or another, that would have serious consequences. In addition, we have a federally designated wild and scenic river. We have the Appalachian Scenic Trail and other important resources that this pipeline would impact. The communities that we're dealing with are all very small communities. The population ranged from a population of 700 to a population of almost 7,000. There are 7 communities that would be directly impacted by this in Berkshire County, not including the others in the other part of the state. These towns all have very limited staff. As Camille said, I think one of your towns had, what, 2 people? We had 3 of our towns didn't have any professional staff. They was entirely run by volunteers and volunteer boards. The other towns would have an administrator or a manager. Massachusetts is a home rule state, and that means that each municipality is responsible for implementing the various laws and regulations that the state may impose. So each town had their own conservation commission trying to implement in Massachusetts, the Wetlands Protection Act, which is a very extensive act that protects wetland resources. And towns also have to implement various public health regulations. This picture shows the town where the compressor station would be located, Windsor, Mass. This is the downtown area of Windsor, Mass. It's a crossroad. It's basically got a convenience store, the town office, and the fire department. I talk about this setting because I think it's important to say when a community or a region is presented with a pipeline proposal, many other times they don't have the resources to deal with them effectively. And we were able to get a TAG grant, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but that was really instrumental in helping us prepare an adequate response to the application process. We started in 2014 when we heard rumblings from our municipal officials that representatives from the pipeline company were going out to their communities, talking with them about the proposal. And then shortly thereafter, we applied for a TAG grant, and then we ended a lot of our work about a year and 3/4 later in October when we filed comments on the environmental impact statement. And subsequently, in this May, the application was withdrawn by the proponent. We responded to this by forming what we called a working group. We intentionally left it vague in terms of a committee or its committee structure. It was really an ad hoc group of select boards and town administrators who wanted to work together to address this proposal. Some of the key elements that they wanted to do was really exchange information, make sure everybody had the same base of information that they were being presented with. And we had heard some conflicting reports from some of the town officials about what they were hearing, when it was going to happen. So we all got together and just wanted to make sure we were on the same page with the information. We also really wanted to be able to understand the FERC licensing process, and more importantly, be able to meaningfully participate in it. With the NED project, the proponent went through a pre-filing phase, which allowed an interchange of information and ideas. And then the third element that we really wanted to do was have a shared approach to negotiations with the pipeline company. Negotiations related mitigation measures, but also if there are any benefits that the communities could accrue from the proposed pipeline. We wanted to make sure that everyone was getting the same type of benefit. We were able in this process to obtain the services of knowledgeable experts. We hired a law firm, BCK Law, with the principal Jeff Bernstein, and also a technical expert, a professor out of the University of Massachusetts, Marco Buscardin, who had been both in the field experience as well as academic experience. When we set up our operating practices with the working group, we set up a few really basic ground rules, again, as ad hoc groups, so these weren't formalized. But we really wanted to we didn't want to take a position on the pipeline as being opposed to it or supporting it. We were advised by our legal counsel that we would be better received in our technical comments if we stayed, somewhat neutral to the idea of, opposing the pipeline or not. We also avoided, and intentionally avoided, some of the key issues that this pipeline presented. This is a very controversial proposal for the Northeast. There's a lot of opposition to it, a lot of groups formed around it. We intentionally decided not to tackle those issues, primarily not because we weren't interested in them, but we didn't have the resources and the expertise to be able to participate in a meaningful way. So the issue of the ultimate destination of the gas, was it going to be used for our own industry or was it going to be shipped offshore? We stayed away from that. We couldn't figure that one out. And the ultimate safety of fracking. This is coming from the Marcellus Shale, and we didn't feel like we could weigh in on whether that was a safe process or not. And finally, the validity of the need for the gas and being gas that was going to be transported. We stayed away from that decision as well. Oh, okay. I say I'm not going to make my time here unless I jump up. That's all right. So what we did was we really held a series of workshops using some of the TAC funds, and these were technical in nature, talked about the roles and responsibilities of different municipal officials, when and how to participate. One of the key elements of interest by our local officials was this whole idea of federal preemption. What local laws were going to be overturned or not through the FERC licensing process. We took a stance that even though we thought most of the laws would be able to be preempted by the federal powers, that we were going to request the pipeline to try to adhere to our local laws. And because we didn't go through with it, we don't know if that was going to be possible yet. But Another set of workshops had to do with pipeline construction 101. What's going to happen? The pipeline proposal was categorized as being the largest construction project in our region since the Turnpike I-90 was built in the mid-50s. So this is going to have a major impact to our, we wanted to have an understanding about that. Another area that we had some training in was emergency response training. I mentioned that we have volunteer fire departments. We were very fortunate to have Philip Oakes, who is the National Program Director or Trainer for the National Association of State Fire Marshals, provide the training. These were well received by our officials. We were able to provide environmental review and land use analysis. Our key role here was really to kind of wade through the filings that were done through FERC. If you've participated on the FERC website, you'll know that you get hundreds of these items, and we needed to pull those out and sort through that information. Another element of our review was ongoing communications with FERC through the pre-filing process. We were able to participate on so-called agency conference calls. These happened on a regular basis, and we've got first-hand information from the proponent and the various agencies. The TAG grant, specifically the items in the TAG grant, had to do with education and awareness, environmental review and land use analysis, and pipeline failure emergency response training. And those all were very important in our overall process. I do want to say that the TAG grant was one part of our effort. And this was, for us, a very expensive effort to participate in. And I want to, when I hear the millions of dollars and maybe billions of dollars that I've heard about some of the costs of the pipeline, these numbers might sound insignificant. But it cost our agency about $220,000 to participate in these 2 years. The TAG grant was for $50,000, which helped bring in our expertise. And we were fortunate to have some other funds from Massachusetts for technical assistance. But our municipalities, many of them which have very small budgets, ponied up quite a bit of the money. They put up, about 40% of that, the funds for that. So the lessons learned, key issues and lessons learned, that it takes multiple and substantial resources to be able to meaningfully participate. And you need to be prepared to make a sustained effort. This is something that we had parts of 3 people working on for these 2 years, just to get to the point of commenting on the EIS. There would have been several other years worth of work that we would have had to have done. I mentioned that we took a somewhat of a neutral stance on opposing the pipeline or not. That did not come without a cost, especially to our municipal officials. They took a lot of flack for not saying that they should have opposed the pipeline. Why didn't they oppose the pipeline? What's wrong with them? And then I mentioned that this is a very important issue to the towns, though, because they were willing to commit substantial financial resources for them to do it. Another key element, and I think this was mentioned at one of the earlier talks, was finding experts that weren't conflicted out is very challenging, especially in our area. We wanted to try to find some local engineering firms to help, but they were already working for the pipeline company, so it was very difficult. But it is important to use experts that had been through the process. Our legal counsel had worked through the process before, some 20 years ago, and one of the earlier ones, he was very familiar with the process, and that was very invaluable to our overall effort. Participating in these FERC-led pre-filing conference calls was indispensable. We were able to get first-hand information from both the proponent and where FERC was in terms of the overall schedule, and then watching the schedule was very important as well. Some other observations that maybe I'm a little bit editorializing here on my own, but we were surprised when we received the first filing at the inadequacy of the information in the initial filing. We thought with a major pipeline company that we would have some better information, and we didn't. They had things dramatically wrong. It had to be verified, validated. I mean, things like the placements of a road or the name of a lake or the name of a pond was very inaccurate. And then the other observation that the proponent withdrew their application because they didn't have the contracts for the gas. They didn't have the market for the gas. It seemed that we had to expend extensive resources prior to the determination of market need. And I know the gentleman from the Southern Environmental Law Foundation talked about need. And this is an element that I think really needs to be seriously looked at before these proposals go forward. And as I've been listening to the presentations today, and I want to say that I'm not a pipeline expert either, I do want to say that I think that if PHMSA was involved in the licensing, I think it would be some of the safety issues would be eliminated that ultimately come down the road. It didn't seem like that was given much credence in the overall process. So thank you.